Hey, I'm John,
And I'm Josh.
and this is Dungeon Brew, where we talk about all things homebrew.
Welcome to Dungeon Brew.
One of the biggest pieces of homebrewing is making sure that you're giving vital attention to all three pillars, including combat, when you're creating your campaign. I'm curious what you do to make sure that the combat encounters that you're creating for your characters are balanced and worthwhile, I guess, in terms of the story overall, for the purpose of them being there when you're putting those into gameplay.
Okay, so when it comes to balancing, there are 5 things really that you should be paying close attention to. The first one is player level, not player character level. Character level. So in regard to character level, I mean the CR can be a guide for that to some degree, especially below about level 5. At level 5, there's a big break in power, and that occurs other times throughout the leveling process, usually aligned with the tiers of play. But you want to pay attention to the character level. You want to pay attention to player experience. A newer player versus a more seasoned player are going to have different approaches to combat and be more familiar with things. I've definitely experienced this quite a bit over the last couple of years as we've brought in some newer players into our play group, where I would expect them to take advantage of a flanking situation or take advantage of a damage type or a weapon type or something else, learn from what is effective and not effective in a combat scenario, and they don't take advantage of that in the way that I expected them to, and that definitely comes in when it comes to balancing encounters. The next one is magic items. How much magical gear does the group have? Are they able to deal with threats that have to do with being resistant or immune to various types of damages? Because if they're not familiar with those things, or if they don't have the equipment necessary in order to counter those, then those encounters become more difficult. There's definitely a sense that the CR is pre-built into some of those resistances and immunities, but sometimes that doesn't always play out the way that you think. The difficulty of a bearded devil, because of its resistances to magic, non-magic damage, its immunity to things like poison. I think it's immune to fire maybe as well. Those resistances and immunities make it a far more difficult encounter for low-level characters without magic items, and even higher-level characters without magic items. A level 5 character without a magic item is going to have a much harder time with a bearded devil than a level 3 or level 2 character with a magic item, incidentally. So 4 is the type of monsters you're throwing in. So I talked about the bearded devil, for instance, but it also has to do with sometimes the CR does not necessarily match how strong the monster is. So in one of my earlier campaigns, I had an experience, especially in 5e, where I was still getting familiar with the rule set. There was a Minotaur skeleton that criticaled on one of my players and took him from full life to 0. It was balanced for the encounter, from what I understood, but it was not expected, and it really kind of threw the entire party off, just in terms of like how much that affected their ability to deal with that encounter, because it comes out the gate and does 48 damage on a critical, and that's enough to take a level 2 or level 3 character even all the way to 0. So it can be very dangerous when you're trying to balance those out. You have to be careful about including high damage monsters like those, like ogres, like bugbears. All of them do a ton of damage, and they can wreak havoc on a party if they're not prepared for it. And you need to pay attention to that when you're trying to balance encounters. And then the last thing is balancing encounters. Sometimes you need to not look at an encounter as balancing a single encounter for the party, but instead of looking at a variety of encounters throughout the day. So when you're designing an entire dungeon, you don't just look at the first encounter, you look at every encounter that's going to be sprinkled along their path and try and balance them not only against the party, but what their anticipated strength is going to be at the first encounter versus the third encounter versus the nth encounter, depending on where they get to. versus something like a random encounter where you know it's the only encounter they're going to have for that day, in which case you can ramp up the difficulty somewhat because you know they're going to have more resources at their disposal.
And I imagine for when you're building encounters in a dungeon as well, do you put in idealized like rest points or short rest areas for them to recuperate some of their losses in life or supplies so they can continue on through that? How do you make sure that that's balanced so that the party doesn't get, decimated at the entrance of the dungeon and no place to relax, and then still having to reach a boss without having their resources available to them?
So it can go either way, really, honestly, because if you are balancing the dungeon against the idea that there will be no time for rests, then that's how you balance the dungeon. If you're balancing the dungeon with the idea that they will have time for short rests or long rests, then you balance the dungeon for that. It really is one of those things where you can go in either direction. When it comes to figuring in those balancing points, that is the importance of having things like empty rooms in the dungeon. Not if you want them to have the opportunity for rest. Building in empty rooms and not having every single room filled with some kind of monster is going to be beneficial to allow that feeling of not only the dungeon being larger, but also the feeling that there are places of relative safety within the structure.
Mm-hmm. Your first point, you were talking about character level and making sure that you were looking at that as one of the elements in balancing encounters. Well, characters with their levels has brought up this thought for me that there is a specific amount of experience that characters gain from level to level,
right?
Which means that you only have certain encounters that you might have access to if you want to introduce certain monsters to a setting that are related to the story, or certain encounters to have available at certain levels. And maybe I'm just overthinking this a little bit, but let's say that you have 900 experience that they can gain in a particular level, and that may be balanced in adventuring experience, role-playing experience, quest experience, then also monster experience. Does that tailor your choice in terms of like, okay, they can only fight kobolds or goblins or whatever that would fit within this character level, and I want to make sure I introduce these monsters and these types of encounters for them so that it adds to the story that I'm telling? Is that making sense?
I think it does, and I think it bleeds actually point 4 and point 1, which in retrospect, point 1 is character level, point 4 is monsters that you're choosing. So it's both of those things together. And honestly, so like there's a couple of pieces here. There's the piece where you could go, I really want low levels or whatever level they happen to be at to feel as though it can take more time, because you can choose lower powered creatures, and because of the bounded accuracy of 5th edition, where a kobold is very likely to still hit a level 5 or a level 10 character, because your ACs never really get that high, and then they have pack tactics and all this other stuff. A kobold is still dangerous at higher levels in terms of it can do damage. It doesn't do a ton of damage, but it can still hit. But it doesn't necessarily mean that your kobold is less viable at higher levels. Generally, the opposite is true. You have the higher level monsters that you struggle to introduce at lower levels, because introducing them at lower levels means that they're more likely to just completely wipe the party out. Generally, what I like to do is I never really get rid of those low level monsters. Recently, you guys are, I think, level 5 or 6 or something like that in the current campaign. I still threw a ton of zombies at you guys. The zombies are, I think, CR 1/2 or something like that. They're very low CR creatures. But they actually ended up creating a lot of trouble. They weren't doing a lot of damage, but they were taking a lot of your attention. You couldn't ignore them. The dangerous creature in that encounter was the Bodak. And the Bodak, I think, is a CR 6. So I had a CR creature that was pretty much equal with you guys in terms of level. And I brought in a bunch of the lower ones because I knew that they were still able to hit. I knew that they were difficult to kill because of the way that they get their constitution saves whenever they are supposed to die. And I knew that if they did hit, then they were still able to do some damage. They weren't going to kill you guys. I wasn't really concerned about that, but they distracted you from the main enemy. It made it to where the entire party was not able to focus on the most dangerous creature in the room because they were being surrounded by zombies. So using the lower level creatures is a way to fill out for higher level creatures to make the encounter feel fuller, to make it feel more dangerous without actually increasing a whole lot of danger there. And that's why I like to use those things. But it also, like, to go back to your original question here, it also is a situation where it's like you don't necessarily have to feel restricted from using various monsters at various levels, with the exception of being careful about trying to pull in, a young dragon against your level 3 players or something like that. That can be something you really want to be careful about because the CR is much too high. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't take the lower ones and bring them up.
Do you ever struggle with having just a really cool or fun monster that you really want to have in the campaign, but it doesn't fit in the setting? I mean, I know right now you may be having an area where there's, zombies and skeletons, but maybe there's other monsters that you want to pull in, and it's just like, well, it doesn't fit in the setting, and so you try to make an allowance or a way to pull it in there, or do you just leave it out altogether and save it for another campaign?
There's a couple of ways I handle it. Sometimes I can do one-offs where it's like, I really want this monster in here because it fits a cool idea I have. And what I tend to do is what we've talked about before, which is I like to sprinkle things in. So it's like, if I really want that one in there, I will provide a breadcrumb that will lead you to that monster to allow me to have to build that encounter out with the monster that I specifically want. I don't do that very often. Most often what I do is not necessarily the monster, but I will take it and reflavor it. It's not terribly difficult in 5e because of the way that they balance monsters to take a monster and change the name of it, change the color of it, change the specific exterior factors of it, and keep the core monster and be able to still use basically that monster, but in a different scenario.
I'm running an undead campaign, and I really want a beholder, but I can't have beholders here, so meet One-Eye Tim.
Well, I mean,
the zombie with all the beholder traits.
Well, they have undead, but they have zombie beholders, which you can use. I actually had to struggle against throwing a zombie beholder in our current thing because I really wanted to, because I have a beholder-specific region that you guys are going to encounter. And so I was like, I'll leave the zombie beholder out of this dungeon. It doesn't need to be here, even though it's honestly one of my favorite creatures to throw in, and I have no idea why.
Now I know the secrets. We're just going to avoid that region. We will never reach godhood or full divinity.
No, it's honestly it's terrifying. So
I think if I were a real life character, I would avoid the beholder regions. I'd just be like, no, I don't. That's not.
They're fine.
That's not a trophy I need to put on my mantle.
Right. Okay, so we talked a lot about like the initial encounter balance, but what we haven't talked about really is what you do when you failed on that. So you've tried to balance your encounter, right? And then you realize, partway into the encounter, halfway into the encounter, that it's not balanced. You thought it wasn't. And it could be for any number of reasons for why things are going sideways. But how do you address an encounter that is going decidedly against the players?
I feel like I run into this situation pretty often, so I got some answers for you.
That's good.
There's usually about 4 things that I'll do. One is that I just allow it to happen and see if my characters can find their way out of it.
Faith in your players. I like it.
Yeah, which, my last campaign did not end well. I let it happen and they all died.
TPKs are a great opportunity for memory, for forging some memories, so it's not always bad.
Yeah, they'll be talking about that with their grandchildren someday. But sometimes you do just let it happen. And sometimes they have to run with their tail between their legs and, get out of battle, or they suffer their losses, and it's memorable for the characters, and it's a learning experience for all of us.
Right.
The second thing that I might do, especially if the fault is my own, is fudge it. I might fudge things in the background where I have other enemies or waves that are supposed to come in, and I'll start taking those off the list or not allowing them to move forward to not make the encounter any more complicated than it already is. I usually don't fudge dice, honestly. I let the dice be what they are, but maybe I'll sometimes I will like have characters take more actions in combat, like taking a healing potion instead of using 2 weapon attacks for the
right.
monsters that they're fighting. Or I'll fudge their tactics a little bit to give the characters the upper hand.
Okay. Try and keep that subtle though, right? Like under the table. Like this not that the hobgoblin turns his back and starts doing something random to allow you to stab him in said back. It's more along the lines of he got hit this round, so instead of dealing the death blow to the character in front of him, he takes a healing potion, which gives that character arguably the opportunity to heal as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So looking at different tactical plays, it maybe not be the best tactical play for the monster, and having a rationale behind that.
It's still reasonable, though. I mean, it makes sense. The hobgoblin is concerned about its own welfare, so it tries to keep itself alive. No, that makes sense.
Yeah. The third thing that I might do is just rework the flavor that I'm giving to the characters in terms of what's happening in battle, to give them some hints to what might be happening. You know, your arrows that you're shooting aren't doing as much damage. The acid that you're splashing on the monster doesn't seem to have any effect. Trying to give them some suggestive hints that are kind of flavorful and just like the description of battle and what's happening to hint towards what they might try differently or do otherwise. The hobgoblin checks his back to make sure that nobody's approaching from behind before turning and swinging at you a second time. Things like that, to be like, maybe here's some tactical plays you might do to...
Right, like why aren't you flanking him?
Yeah.
Type of a thing. Well, and some of that seems like sensory input as well. You know, if you're always using your acid splash, then you would be familiar with how it affects enemies, but for some reason it's not affecting this enemy. Maybe you should be trying different tactics. It seems like that's the kind of thing that probably gets newer players in trouble more than anything else. Just not realizing, the resistances or immunities or other things like that going on. Okay.
Which even myself, who's seasoned, I don't always remember all of those. And when you jump through multiple editions, we were playing the other day, and I was still getting confused going back to 3.5, being like, what? Your undead have constitution? What? They're not immune to this? And so even for myself as a seasoned individual, I sometimes make the wrong move as a player, forgetting the new rule that had changed.
Yeah, no, I remember that, because I think that there was the ogre zombie was able to get frightened because, fear. They're not immune to fear. They're not immune to the frightened condition. And which seems odd, but it's, it hasn't, it's something that still exists. So.
And then the fourth thing that I will sometimes do is maybe bring in an outside source, NPCs, someone to help weigh the battle back in the player's favor as well. And I haven't done this a lot. We've talked about this before. I think that it has to make sense to the setting,
right?
When you're introducing that. But there have been games where, again, in the Hell campaign that I ran, I had the Bard, the spiritual ghost entity that was kind of there, that I could bring in to kind of help sway the battle back in your direction. And I had him there in case I was outweighing things, because suddenly you were fighting against devils and demons and you hadn't done it before. And I wasn't sure that every battle was necessarily balanced. And so I had him there kind of on reserve if I needed to pull him in.
Kind of like the tutorial style NPC. So like Skyrim, you're running around with either the Nord guy or the Empire guy. God. How terrible is that?
The Stormcloaks or the Imperials.
Thank you. Jeez. Stormcloaks or Imperial. You either have a Stormcloak or an Imperial tutorial NPC that basically is alongside with you to make sure you're not getting overwhelmed as you're going through that piece. So that makes sense, because when we went into Hell, we hadn't been there before, obviously. So not only was it a new experience for the players in terms of are they going to be able to handle this? Are the characters, well enough equipped to deal with this? But also for you as a DM going, am I balancing this the way that I thought that I was? Because I haven't balanced these encounters yet for this group. I'm going to, offer something else on the back end just to make sure that things don't get too crazy.
Yeah, and that was especially challenging because you guys went in around like level 10 or 11 or something like that. Right. So usually when you're creating encounters, you're doing it in baby steps, moving them up through levels and kind of seeing what they can handle and what their play style is and what their tactics look like in the course of it. And so when I then throw you into an entirely different environment with all new monsters, it's going to be different. And so I wanted to make sure that there was a buffer to help them respond to those encounters without just being killed immediately.
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
Yeah. So those are the 4 things that I would typically look at when they get imbalanced. And I think for anyone that's homebrewing campaigns, you're going to run into this issue. It's not something you can avoid. You are going to run into imbalanced encounters when you're putting them together yourself. And for many DMs, as much as we love the game, a lot are not just like mathematicians that are on the side crunching numbers and going, okay, does this fit my rubric to make sure that they can go into battle and survive?
Right. And I mean, even if you are, the thing is that the roll of the dice are, as much as you can, look at the statistics, they're largely unpredictable. There have been games where I think I rolled like 4 critical misses in a row trying to do something as a character, and then as a DM, there have been games where I've just rolled critical hit after critical hit against my player characters, and they're getting completely destroyed by what should be a relatively simple encounter, but because I'm just rolling nonstop critical hits, it becomes a far more difficult encounter than I originally anticipated. And that's when you have to start taking some of those options into account, just in terms of like, how do I triage the encounter so that we don't end up with something completely crazy?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I will say that I never have done, I've considered it because I almost thought it'd be an interesting piece of gameplay, is having like a reload button, but just for the purposes of just like the tech that we use. We play on Fantasy Grounds a lot. We used to play on Roll20, but even playing in person, it's hard to reset time and go back and hit a reload button. So it's not something that I would typically advise to do. Be like, well, this didn't work. Let's start back at town and go back out on the adventure again. I think that it's best to look at it from lessons learned and look at other ways to address it than having characters start over.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I'm sure that there are instances where tables have chosen to do that, retconning various things. And we've done that when it makes sense, if it's in a relatively immediate future. I forgot to apply damage or whatever this round. But in terms of like a long haul, we're just going to reset the dungeon or reset to whatever. I feel like for me, I lose a lot of that suspension of disbelief in those instances. It's like, well, then it doesn't really matter if I die, if we're just going to reset and go back to town or whatever. It makes it feel like the entire, the campaign, the reality or the false reality of living in this fantasy world is completely lost at that point. So sometimes, like I said, lessons learned, and you rebuild and you go, okay, I'm going to roll up a new character, or we're going to roll up a new party and start a new campaign, and it happens.
And when you've been playing for a long time, there's actually a lot of enjoyment in that. You and I talked about this the other day, and this is probably a good spot to end, but it's actually kind of exciting when your character dies.
Yeah, like, I admit that I crave character death.
Jon and Brew.
Hey, thanks for hanging out with us today. Please check out some of the stuff we're doing. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel, join us on our Discord, or go and watch us stream on Twitch, where we're at 4 or 5 days a week. All the links are down below. We look forward to hearing from you.
Jon and Brew.
God damn it, that's not the response you want. Let me try again.
That's there may be too much honesty in that response.
I had a campaign where a character lost his eye and his arm and a leg, and then he had a rib broken. And he just said, what? Can I create somebody new? No, you're stuck with that son of a bitch.
Jon and